features on the regulator that you need to be aware of. The first thing, we'll look at the back. It's got a diameter index safety system fitting on it. It's called a DISS fitting. You need to secure this to the wall outlet if it's not already secured by simply matching it up to the appropriate station outlet and then turning it on or attaching it to the wall outlet by just simply turning the knob here to the right, and that'll attach it firmly to the station outlet like ours are already attached. The next thing we're going to look at, we have the front. It's got the gauge. This gauge tells us how much negative pressure is being applied back to the patient. The knob underneath the gauge allows us to set the pressure we want to be applied to the patient. And then on the top here, we've got a little selector valve or a selector switch. Right now it's in the off position, which means the regulator is turned off. When you turn it to the REG or reg position like this, what that indicates is you can now set or adjust the suction pressure you want this device to control it to. If you go from regulate to off to full, what the full feature means is it automatically allows this regulator, the suction regulator, to apply full negative pressure that your suction source, way beyond those walls, is capable of producing. And we really don't know what exactly that is, what our suction device way back behind the walls is capable of producing. But by simply setting this selector switch to full, you get the maximum amount of suction that the device is capable of generating. Okay? So adjustable when it's on regulate, and you can switch it to full to give you full line suction pressure, full line negative pressure back to your patient head. Okay? So if you think about it, when you've got it to regulate, it essentially means that you want to regulate or adjust the pressure you want your patient to get. And that would be specific for the different tasks you're using the regulator for. If you had it set to full, well, now you're not too concerned about what the suction pressure is the patient's going to get. You just want whatever's inside the patient or around the patient to be removed as quick as possible. And safety isn't necessarily a concern for the patient at that time. All right? So that's this basic regulator. And most of them have these features on it. Now I said that the regulator, the second regulator, regulator B, is slightly different than this regulator. So let's take a look at that regulator. So here's the two regulators, look very similar. This is the regulators in 3D. So what's the big difference? Well, the big difference between the two regulators, other than the fact that regulator B has this shaded area, most of the features are the same. It's got the pressure gauge. It's got the knob for adjusting the suction level you want the patient to get. Same DISS connection for hooking it up to your station outlet. Has a selector valve at the top. You can toggle it to the left. You can toggle it to the right. So what's the difference? Well, if you look at it, it says regulate, off, and then int. Int or INT stands for intermittent. So what this regulator allows you to do is it allows you to set or adjust your suction pressure you want the patient to get with this knob. But it also allows you to have that pressure continuously applied when it's in regulate, or when it's set to intermittent. It's kind of like an on-off suction that the patient gets. The suction, when it's on interval, is applied for a certain period of time, like 8 to 10 seconds, and then it shuts off for 8 to 10 seconds. Then it goes back on for 8 to 10 seconds, and then back off again. And the regulator just keeps flipping from active suctioning to no suctioning, active suctioning to no suctioning. So it's an intermittent feature. Allows suction to be applied to the patient intermittently. Where you probably see that used a lot is with gastric suctioning. So if you're using gastric suctioning and you're using a nasogastric tube or an orogastric tube that's a single channel, we like to have them set to intermittent so it doesn't cause too much damage back to the gastric lining of the stomach. Okay? So the two different types of regulators. Beware of which type of regulator you have and what features it has on it so that you can choose. Now, you notice with this suction regulator it doesn't have the full setting. You can still get full line suction on this particular regulator by simply having it set to regulate, and then crank this up as high as it goes and see if you can get the full line pressure out of it. So you can still do that. You can still have very high levels of suction with this intermittent suction regulator. Cool? Right on. There's also other types of suction regulators out there on the market. We just have a few of them in stock that we keep here for use. they all pretty much do the exact same thing. They're just slightly different in terms of color or in terms of the features. This one's a little bit different because this suction regulator here that I'm holding right now, it's got a digital display. So instead of it having a gauge on it to show you what the value of suction is, this one displays the value digitally. So a little fancier, I guess. It's got a couple of features on the top. It just says off and regulate. So with this one, it doesn't have that intermittent function, and it doesn't have the selector where it can go directly to full line suctioning. Okay. To go back to the patient, and also to set this up correctly, is a collection unit. So you'll have to have one of these collection units. On the top of the collection units, it's got a couple of different openings, etc. When you're setting this up and you use it, you need to have this set up appropriately. So on this, you can see it says ortho, vacuum, and patient. Essentially, vacuum means you need to hook up the tubing that comes from the regulator to the vacuum port. That's where that one goes. Patient means this is where you hook up the tubing that goes now to the patient, the suction tubing. And with the suction tubing, you would then hook up whatever apparatus you needed to be used to effectively suction your patient. For example, if you're going to suction your patient out orally, you would use an oral suction. We commonly refer to those as Yonker suctions or tonsil suctions. Okay? So you need the suction collection unit. Make sure all the caps are on securely and that the lid is on it securely as well. Do a little check. Should have some sort of pressure relief, or not a pressure relief, sorry, a float mechanism inside of it that stops the fluid contents from going into your suction regulator. It's a safety system on as well. But make sure all the caps are on there nice and secure. When it is, you can then go and place it into your bracket that holds the collection unit apart. You can then take your tubing here, get a shot of the tubing. The tubing attaches to the bottom of the suction and it goes to the collection unit. And then you can use the patient port to attach your suction tubing to it. So here's some suction tubing, and you can tell it's suction tubing because it's got these nice wide ends on it. It tapers down, but both ends taper to a nice wider opening, so you can connect it to different types of, for lack of a better term, orifices. So we'll take this, we'll attach it over here to the patient connection end. Now we just simply need to attach this to whatever device we want to use on our patient. Catheter, tonsil suction, a Yonker suction, oral catheter, oral suction, nasogastric tube, thoracic suction, what have you. So I'm just going to simply attach this oral suction device. Whoa, fairly strong. Now we need to set our suction up before we use it on our patient. So whenever you're dealing with secretions with a patient, always make sure that you're wearing the appropriate personal protective equipment, the PPE, that's designated for that patient with their infectious precautions that they might have. It's a means of protecting yourself and a means of protecting the patient. So you should have gloves on when you're doing that. Now let's say I want to adjust this suction level to some safe value for the patient. I didn't want it to have full line. Well, all I would have to do at that point in time is just simply grab the end of the suction tubing, turn the regulator on to regulate, and all of a sudden there's a pressure level on here. If the suction was completely off, the pressure inside the gauge would say 0. If there's some suction inside the gauge, or it's on, or if it's turned on to a certain value, it'll also reflect that as well. Okay, so it all depends on how it was left before. We'll assume that the suction was in fact turned off. Now, if I wanted to adjust this pressure up to say minus 200 millimeters of mercury, all I'd have to do is occlude the suction that goes closest to the patient on the suction tubing, set this to regulate, and now just simply increase the suction pressure or negative pressure or vacuum pressure the gauge is capable of producing. I would simply adjust this to 200. Now the pressure inside the suction tubing back to the collection unit, back to the suction regulator is roughly minus 200 millimeters of mercury. That's what would be applied to the patient end.